Welcome to Brain in a Vat. This is our final episode for the year, and it's partly a way of us saying thank you to you for listening for the last year. It's been an incredible journey for us. We've had some absolutely wonderful conversations with some of the top philosophers in the world, and we thought we'd just give you a sense of what the future is for Brain in a Vat.
We're going to be having some fantastic guests on next year. We've already interviewed a few and recorded, and they're ready to go from January. But what we'd really like to know is who would you like us to invite onto the show next year? They don't have to be a philosopher. And if there's not a particular person that you'd like invited on the show, what questions would you like us to ask? What topics would you like us to cover?
So, Jason, this really has been a delight to do with you, and it's an idea that we'd had, rolling around in our heads for quite a long time, and could just never find the right opportunity to do it. And I think one of the benefits of being locked in our houses for many months was that it gave us this impetus to do it. So, if you look back on the episodes that we've recorded, which are the ones that stand out for you?
Yeah, so what was really interesting is, as you say, what the impetus was lockdown, and we started with a lockdown episode. And then we started inviting some of our friends on, local South African philosophers, and it grew. And very quickly, it spread all over the world. My favorite guest was Graham Oppy. So Graham is a philosopher of religion, and he asked questions around whether God exists. But what was so incredible about Graham Oppy was not the answers that he gave, which are fairly stock standard answers around the argument from evil, but the humility with which he talked about those answers. He is an atheist, but he presents his arguments in such a way that he's very humble and uncertain about his conclusions. He says, yeah, I think the argument is successful that God doesn't exist, but it certainly is not conclusive. In other words, there are definitely ways in which the argument can be challenged, and there are legitimate challenges to each of his premises. And I think because of that, he's very approachable, both by theists and atheists, and it was really fantastic to have him on the show.
Yeah, and I think we really need to have Graham back on. I know he's quite keen to talk about philosophy in its own right and the nature of argumentation. And without a doubt, I think that's one of the things that's interesting about philosophers is we don't hold this fiery certainty. We don't sort of say, I definitely know. We say, I think the arguments favor me, but I could be wrong. And I want to hear what the other side has to say. I think one of the joys is being able to connect with people that have been close to us personally. So, my supervisor was David Benatar, and I thought our episode with him was really challenging. I mean, it's one of the most controversial positions, is this idea that, it's better never to have been born, and that from the cosmic perspective, our lives just aren't that meaningful. And we could then have Thad Metz, who's a close friend of both of ours, sort of give a contrary view on that and talk about why he thinks life is meaningful. And of course, having Mark Leon on, who supervised you throughout honors, masters, and your PhD, he was just such a fantastic guest, and talking about free will, one of those really pivotal questions, was quite challenging for both of us, and a real delight.
Yeah, there's something very special about connecting with people through ideas. It's wonderful to connect with people over lunch. It's wonderful to talk about one's life and to ask about theirs, and to connect and ask questions about their families. But there's something very special about connecting through kind of a pure intellectual enterprise like philosophy. And also, what's so cool about talking to other philosophers is that we all disagree. It's not as though we all agree, which is perhaps something quite different from a religious institution, where most people agree at least on the fundamentals if you're within the religious institution. Philosophers disagree on literally everything. Mark and I disagree on, I think there's very few claims that we hold, both of us, but we both agree on with one thing, and that is that we think that the pursuit of inquiry and understanding and knowledge is important. And that's why we created this channel. And to be able to have very calm, frank, interesting discussions with philosophers about sometimes very charged and emotional topics, but in a way that really crystallizes the abstract philosophy involved, has been incredibly satisfying for me, at least.
Yeah, I think part of the idea is saying that these conversations can ordinarily be quite hard to have. If you're talking about very contentious moral questions, people often get very heated, and they don't want to surrender ground. And the conversation we've had with people, it's this spirit of open inquiry. We often take positions that, we don't necessarily believe in, but we probe our guests so we can try and get to the truth of the matter. I mean, I also have to say, like, one of the true joys for me, so I used to run a philosophy club with one of our prior guests, Helen Robertson, and we would get together every couple of weeks and we would, read books together and discuss. And one of those books was written by Raja Halwani. And so having him on the show twice to talk about love and sex was just such a delight, because, we'd read the work, we'd discussed the work, and he's just the nicest person, just so open and kind and interesting. And, the kind of relationships that have developed because of the show has been really just an extra benefit for us. And I think we've had other people who we've sort of read about over the years or thought about over the years, and having that personal connection with them, someone like, Brian Leiter, who runs, the most famous philosophy blog in the world. Just also what a wonderful human being, and such a fascinating conversation about the Supreme Court and about law and about politics. And then having someone like Rebecca Tuvel on as well, who also has sort of gone through the turmoil of being publicly attacked for writing a piece, and then being sort of overwhelmed with support from philosophers all around the world. And then having her on our show was, a real highlight.
Yeah. The thing about studying philosophy is that you read these great minds through their words in books. I studied them throughout my master's and PhD, and now I'm meeting them, and I would never have gotten the chance to do that. It's quite incredible. And what I found most interesting about talking to other philosophers through this medium is that even though they publish an enormous number of articles and books, they often don't get a chance to really discuss their views with just a genuinely curious interlocutor. It's often an opponent, another philosopher who disagrees with them, and then they'll have an argument, but just someone who's curious about what they believe. And I often find that when we get guests on and we just give them the space to give their views, and we do present them with some objections, but really just to get to the nub of what they really believe, they're very, very generous, and very pleased to be on the show. And I think we've, as Mark said, we've developed some fantastic connections with some great minds this way. Raja in particular, we have a long email chain going with him, and he's hilarious and also just generous and kind, lovely man.
So I suppose one of the things that viewers don't know is a little bit of how the show is made. So, they get to see an edited version of the show, but often we record for a few hours with our guests. We sort of do a little bit of a get to know you. And this is an interesting thing for me is, the get to know you we do on the day. So, we send off a mail, we sort of explain a bit what we're like. We send our guests, a prior episode of someone that they think they'll connect with. But it's a bit like a blind date. And you've got to create rapport very quickly. And I found that a fascinating process, is it's rapport also not in person, it's over Zoom. And very quickly trying to sort of establish, what you care about and what you want to talk about. And, I found that that's made a big difference. Often I'll try and spend, about 20 minutes, half an hour getting to know someone before we hit the record button. And then afterwards we stop recording, and we often chat for quite a long time after that. And that's been really interesting, finding out what's going on in the academy behind the scenes, chatting about all sorts of other issues. And I think also getting a sense of who we want to have back on the show, which further topics we should get in touch with. It's been a real part of the fun. I have to say, one of the things that's really stood out to me, YouTube is kind of renowned for having some of the most toxic comments on the internet. And our viewers are amazing. I mean, we've had incredible, rolling essays between people. And if you go and watch Sean Stanley's episode on Whether Race Exists, there is essays written by Sean and by others on the piece itself, a back and forth that's persisted for months. If you look at the comments on David Benatar's piece as well, really substantive, clever stuff. And it's kind of what's made me keep doing it. I've just found that the insights from viewers, the private emails we've gotten, it's been really quite special.
And also in Graham Oppie's episode, lots of discussion from theists and atheists on arguments for and against God, some of which I hadn't encountered before. And so I started chipping in on some of the arguments. But these guys have studied this a lot longer than I have. And it was really interesting to see the depth that people have thought through these issues. Yeah, it's really fantastic to have these kind of discussions. And what we find is that even though our guests are usually philosophers, our listeners are not. So that has been very rewarding for us to give this content in a way that is accessible more generally. And also what we find is it's not a dumbing down of the content when one does that. It's often finding another way of putting a very complicated point that illustrates something that we didn't know in the first place. And so when we express this in very, very simple terms, it really pushes us to get to the nub of what we're saying. And it's often very difficult. It's much easier to use jargon. But when we really try to simplify what we're trying to say, and our guests are doing the same because we instruct them to do so, it really pushes them to, when there's something absurd about their position, then it gets said in ways that are very clearly absurd. And so when you listen to these guests, even if you disagree with them, it's so impressive how they are displaying a position which can be very counterintuitive, but displaying it and arguing for it in such a way that's so clear and easy to believe. And that's a skill that so many of our guests have shown, and it's really been fantastic to be a part of that.
Yeah, so I think one of the uphill battles for us is that philosophy has a certain kind of reputation among the public, which is that basically it's bullshit artists. The philosophers that are kind of well known to average Joes tend to be continental philosophers. So, they're thinking about Foucault and Derrida, maybe Sartre, Nietzsche, and there's a lot of obfuscatory language, a lot of technical jargon, a lot of it sounds really smart, but I'm not actually sure what this person's talking about. And our discipline is analytic philosophy, so we're striving for clarity, simpleness. And as you say, when a person can't hide behind language, then you know at least what they're saying, and then you can engage with it. And I think I'm hoping that a lot of people have said, "Wow, this is a lot more accessible than I expected. Maybe philosophy is something that I could pursue in more detail." That it's not above my pay grade, that ultimately I think, our idea is to try and make it as understandable as possible and as entertaining as possible.
Yeah, and on that note, Mark and I have often chosen these topics because these are topics that are very important within philosophy and also that interest us personally. But there must be other topics that we haven't thought of that would interest you. And so if there are some burning questions that you have about the nature of existence, about the way life should be lived, about what's right and wrong, about anything, philosophy touches on every subject. We'd be very curious to hear what your questions are. And so we can create episodes on those topics.
Yeah, and we have had some direct requests from some of our listeners saying you have to get so and so on the show, and we've gone out and done that. And I think that's also part of the fun. It introduces us to people we wouldn't have necessarily thought about. We're also a bit of a philosophy smorgasbord. So we've done moral questions, political questions, metaphysics, philosophy of sci-fi, art, love. But it's all through the same paradigm of inquiry, of trying to get to the truth, of having a conversation. I mean, I think the other thing that's dawned on us a few months ago was that there are different ways of consuming this content. And so one of our ideas was to produce a book based on our first 2 episodes. So the book's called Lockdown, Did Government Do the Right Thing? And we've made the book available on Amazon. And my thinking at the time was this will be a book that'll have, a sort of very short currency that for, this mad moment that we're in at the moment, people will want to know whether lockdowns are a good idea or a bad idea, weighing in mind the health consequences and the economic consequences. And the pandemic really has lasted much, much longer than I think we'd anticipated. And the book still remains very relevant. I mean, my hope was for the book to become totally and utterly irrelevant, but I think that's not the case. So if you guys are interested in having a look at the book, we'll have a description to where you can buy it below. We're also just on the cusp of getting to 1,000 subscribers. I think by the time that you watch this video, we'll be there. And that's sort of a real mark in the sand for us. We're really excited about reaching that benchmark. And we couldn't have done it without all the sort of support that we've gotten during this year from everyone sharing our content. And it's also interesting to us that those of you that are listening on YouTube seem to be quite different from those that listen on our podcasts. Some of you might be unaware of the fact that there's an audio version or that there's a video version. And other things that Jason and I do, you're probably unaware of, is prying into all the analytics. So we find out where our listeners are based. We're based in South Africa, and so in the beginning, most of our listeners were based in South Africa, and now we find that South Africa is actually a minority in terms of listeners. That we have listeners a lot in the States, Canada, the UK, and people from all over the show. There's listeners in Emirates, in Malaysia, in the Philippines, in Australia.
Yeah, and we're really excited to invite you back onto our show next year. As I say, we've had content already recorded. We're going to be having one of the most exciting guests that I've been looking forward to, who is a well-versed and trained anarchist. So you may have picked up through the show that I'm an anarchist. But anarchism is not fully explored in academia and in philosophical circles. And so my anarchism is probably quite unreflected compared with our guest who's coming up. And I'm very excited to show you that episode. It's already recorded. And there's so much content coming next year. We're really excited to have you join us.
And the other little one that I'm going to tease, which I think is really exciting, we have one of our past guests talking about one of our sort of favorite films, which is Tenet. So make sure you watch it by the time our episode releases. We try and work out whether it makes any sense, whether it's just entertaining explosions in reverse, or whether it makes sense. And we talk about the philosophy of time travel, and we talk about a whole range of interesting things around literature. And we plan on doing a bit more on that front as well, sort of expanding into having philosophical conversations with people that aren't necessarily academic philosophers. So we have some other famous artists lined up. And again, we look forward to hearing some recommendations from you. So finally, thanks for listening during the year. It's been wonderful to have your feedback, and we'll see you in January.